All right. Stewart, I appreciate your time here today. I guess unless you have any other questions, we can jump right into it.
Sure.
Okay, Stewart. What country do you hail from?
I was born in Luxembourg. It's a very small country in Western Europe between France, Germany, and Belgium. About 500,000 people, so you probably won't find it on a map.
Huh, okay. Interesting. All right. So, if you don't mind my asking, what exactly brought you to the U.S. specifically?
Um, so specifically college.
Okay.
More generally, my mom is American. I used to spend a lot of time in the States as a kid over the summers.
Okay.
And so I've always been kind of drawn to the US, living in Luxembourg, kind of going back and forth, spending my summers here, also very much influenced by American culture.
Okay.
And so I think there was kind of that general draw, but then also specifically went to college, went to Brown for my undergrad, moved back to Luxembourg for a couple of years, and then moved to San Francisco for a job, and I've been here ever since.
Okay. All right. So you came. You said you came over for college. Was that a solo move? Did you come over here by yourself, or did you bring other people with you?
By myself.
Okay.
By myself. I have some family in the States, but mostly in New York and Ohio.
Okay.
I went to school in Rhode Island, so nobody really nearby. My mom dropped me off, and it's pretty much me in college, undergrad.
All right. So you said you moved, or you were coming, like kind of to America and back to Luxembourg, summers with a family. What was what age were you first exposed to the States?
I was younger than I can remember.
Okay.
I'd say most years we'd come for between like 3 and maybe 6 weeks during the summers, maybe occasionally for Christmas too. And that was pretty much an annual thing. We did a lot of flying.
Okay.
So yeah, every year.
When you moved over here for college, and I guess that was your first extended stay here in the States, did you have any difficulties adjusting to American culture, in air quotes?
So I think when I was younger, there were definitely moments that were a little bit tougher. When you're younger, kids ask all kinds of stupid questions. So I got a lot of like, do they have TV in Luxembourg? And I got a lot of like, living at home in a country that is not English speaking and us speaking English at home, I was only really exposed to, let's say like a certain vocabulary of English. So all of a sudden I'm like 11 or 12 years old, I'm going to a summer camp, and I'm with other American kids who are running around cursing, and I'm like, what does that word mean?
Right.
Like literally on that level. So I think a lot of those difficulties were kind of ironed out when I was younger.
Okay.
When I got to college, I'd say the only weird things were things like the drinking age. In Luxembourg, the drinking age is 16, which means people start drinking when they're like 13. But which also means, by the time you get to college, there's no, oh, let's go get plastered. This is crazy. We have beer. A lot of that stuff I kind of got out of my system. But then you come here and everybody's super uptight about it.
Right.
So that was also kind of strange. Beyond that, I always find like the political situation in the U.S. kind of hard to reconcile, like what the government does here versus what you can get in Europe. But that's kind of a bigger conversation.
Okay. So how long have you been here? I guess for college, your extended stay.
So I moved to Providence in 2006. I went to school for 4 years, moved back to Luxembourg until the beginning of 2012. And then I moved out to San Francisco, and since then I've been in San Francisco and now Atlanta.
Okay, so this is like your almost 10-year anniversary of the U.S.
Yeah, except for that year and a half, 2-year stint. Yeah.
Okay, well, glad I could share your anniversary with you, Stewart. It's been a pleasure. So post grad, I guess post grad, do you plan on staying here in America, or are you looking to go elsewhere?
I think my viewpoint on that has changed over time. When I was much younger, I thought, I have to get back to the States. Definitely want to be there. And I graduated in 2010 for my undergrad. and I've been in the States pretty much the whole time since then. So
Okay.
I have been here post-graduation. Am I going to stay here forever? I don't really know. I'd like to. Really depends on where my family is, you know, how my what raising a family ends up being like for me.
Okay.
I think Luxembourg is kind of small place, a little bit boring, but also a great place to raise a family. Very safe, great infrastructure. Really good place to raise a family. So maybe that's something I'd consider as well.
Okay.
Especially with how the elections are
Yeah.
shaping out.
That's a little terrifying, actually.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how my perspective on it will evolve in the next 5-10 years. For now, my plan is to, once I'm done with my master's program, move back to San Francisco and see how things work from there.
Okay. All right. So I guess this is a little bit of a different question since you've been coming and going for a while now. What were your impressions on the country prior to arriving? Like, what was your thought on like American culture?
That's a tough question to answer because I feel like I've been exposed to it for a very
Right.
long time. My view of American culture, I think, has changed over time, depending on, when I was younger, I came here for 3 to 6 weeks at a time. I would go to basketball camps. I'd be playing outside all summer. We'd go to water parks.
Right.
The weather was great. Like, everything was fantastic. I was spending most of my time in Ohio, which at my age now, I don't think I'd want to spend as much time there as when I was a kid. But when I was a kid, that was like perfect summers every year. And so I think my perspective was very idealistic. Like, the weather's always great, get to have fun, like lots of friends here. As I've grown older, I think some of the things that surprised me again are like the political climate here, the infrastructure, the things that the government provides that aren't really provided, or does not provide that are provided in Europe. I think those are all things that have kind of evolved over time. Does that answer your question? I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Like
culturally, I think when you're in Europe, you get a lot of like imported American culture. So very heavy influence from that perspective. Everything from music to movies. But I think the stuff that you get is much more superficial in Europe than you do in the States. At least like the stuff that comes over from the US is much more superficial. And what I mean by that is more like you get the top 40 hits, you get the big blockbuster movies, but you don't really get the depth and the experience that you get here. I mean, the internet, I feel like, has changed some of that because now you can, even if you're in Europe, go online and find all these movies, all this music, read up about culture. But before that was a big thing, which I can still remember that. Pretty much the only stuff we got was the stuff that was played on the radio, maybe some CDs that made it over, some movies that made it over. So I think I've definitely gotten much more of an appreciation for the breadth of culture that exists in the U.S. after having been here for a few years.
Okay. So growing up, my experience was a bit different than yours because I was here and I stayed here. One of the things that they preach to American kids is, we're just this big cultural melting pot. Is that something you would say you've seen since you've been here?
Yeah, I think so. What's interesting to me about the U.S. is I do think that there is a cultural melting pot in the sense that, like, people who come here, I think, have a tendency to adopt a lot of American norms. I think the U.S. does a pretty good job of, kind of coalescing people around similar sort of values and ideals. Luxembourg is kind of a special place in that it's very small, very low poverty. You don't really have much in terms of like social classes, or it kind of all just fits together. But I think if you go to bigger cities in Europe, like I spent a decent amount of time in Paris and in Germany, I think there you do see where the melting pot does not necessarily always work. You have like these really big housing projects that are basically a separate world unto themselves.
Okay.
And so I think from a cultural perspective, the U.S. does a better job of kind of integrating that. That being said, I think like the U.S. Still has all kinds of problems in terms of, maybe not explicit segregation, but
Right.
There definitely is a class structure that is enforced, though not explicitly. And so I think you have a much stronger melting pot in terms of cultures. I don't know that the melting pot in terms of getting rid of some of those gaps in terms of education, in terms of health outcomes, whether that really works as well here.
Okay. All right. Would you say there are any overarching, or rather, very memorable negative impressions that you had on the U.S. prior to arriving?
I can't really say prior to arriving. I guess.
Or rather, that just now, beforehand, whenever.
Yeah. That's a tough one. Let me think about that some more.
Okay.
Maybe we can come back to it.
All right. Well, yeah, that was the second to last question. So the very
Okay.
last question was, do you have any interest, like your interesting stories from when you first arrived? So I guess that would be like when you were a kid coming to summer camps, maybe.
Yeah.
Just anything that stuck out to you that was like, whoa, America.
Yeah, I think there's some things, even in Luxembourg, I mean, you can tell by the way that I speak and like my name that I'm not from Luxembourg, that I'm born there, but also I never really felt like I was fully a part of that culture.
Okay.
And I kind of felt the same way in the States when I was younger. It was kind of weird growing up feeling like there wasn't really, when I was in Luxembourg, I felt like I needed to be in the States. And when I was in the States, I often had smaller moments where I felt like, oh, maybe I should be in Luxembourg.
Okay.
So kind of straddling those two lines. And I think, one of the examples I gave was like the questions around, do they have TV in Luxembourg? And like, obviously those are very small things, but when you're a kid, I think those things do leave an impression on you. Other memorable experiences. I think coming to tech has been really interesting to me because I went to Brown in the Northeast, which is like, I feel like you don't really get the stereotypical American experience that you see on TV or in movies. Like I think that when I said before that the sort of superficial American culture makes it to Luxembourg, I think, or to Europe, the rest of the world, I think a great example of that is a movie like American Pie. I think you watch American Pie and, well, I think, it's silly, but people actually do form their opinions and perspectives based on a movie like that.
Okay.
And going to Brown, like Brown is not like American Pie.
Not at all.
At Georgia Tech, you get a lot more of those like classic American experiences, like the frat houses, the football games, like the tailgating. Those concepts are completely foreign to someone who does not grow up here.
Okay.
And I think, a lot of people see like cheerleaders, guns, like all of that stuff as very much like, oh, that's what America is like.
Okay.
But then, going back to that richness, I like having spent time in the States too, and living in California, being able to explore, the national parks, the state parks, driving across the country a few times, being able to see, how beautiful so much of the country is and how different the country is too. I think growing up in Luxembourg and being so close to other countries, when I was a kid, like we would drive to south of France or drive to Italy or drive to Germany and do all these trips. And then you come to the States and there's a lot of people here who have, they've maybe gone to the adjacent states or maybe like gone out to the West Coast once in their lifetime. when I was a kid, it was very hard to understand, like, how do you not explore outside of the U.S.?
Right.
But now that I'm here, you realize just how beautiful and how huge this country really is. I can drive to Italy from Luxembourg in 12 hours. From here, driving 12 hours, I can make it to Ohio? So
yeah, that wouldn't even get you across Texas.
Yeah, right.
Driving straight across.
It took me 3 days to drive from San Francisco out here. And so just how huge and rich this country is, I was definitely struck by that, and I hope that people can really appreciate that about this country too, because I feel like we spend so much time arguing about guns and like politics and all of this stuff, and you kind of miss the fact that the U.S. is a beautiful country. It's huge. There's so many people. There's so much richness, and yeah, I think that's been a big part of my experience here as well.
Okay. All right.
Negative things.
Okay.
The infrastructure here sucks. Really bad. Like, okay, Luxembourg is kind of a special case because it's very small. But if you were to ever visit, you would immediately be struck by how immaculate the highways are. Everything lit up, everything perfectly paved. Like, driving through the streets of Atlanta, I'm just like weaving in and out of potholes all the time. The highways are the same way. The infrastructure here is really crumbling, and so that was kind of shocking to me. But now I think we've seen with some of the stuff in Flint, Michigan, it doesn't just limit itself to are the roads good or bad?
Right.
Is the water coming out of your faucet drinkable? That's not a problem that I think you would. At least in Luxembourg, that has never happened.
Right.
In my lifetime, I can't ever recall it. But here it seems like there are a lot of these issues. And so, I worry that some of the idealistic, hopeful stuff that you see in clips from like the 30s and the 50s and the 70s that describe this like beautiful utopian society, I feel like some of that stuff is just catching up to us. And so the infrastructure, I think, is a big negative point. Okay. That's not really cultural, but it's definitely been like
it's
one of the first things I said to my girlfriend, and we've been together for like 7 years now. She had a car and I was driving her car, and I said, man, when I take you to Luxembourg, you're going to see how good the roads are. And it's totally true. Yeah.
No, I definitely get that, especially growing up here. I was just like, this was the norm to me.
Yeah.
It was just like I just thought that everywhere had potholes everywhere. Like,
right.
It was just, and I always heard the excuses. Oh, how is somebody supposed to fix that? Then I went to somewhere else where like they actually took care of the roads. Like it's up in like Syracuse, for example. The area, that specific area, was really nice. It was really well kept.
Yeah.
But down here, it's awful.
Well, and so I guess the U.S. is much bigger, and so it's hard to maintain everything to that level. But I think that's a small point that goes to the broader point, which I made earlier, which is like people here seem to be mostly okay with that. Mm-hmm. I feel like the expectation from your government here is much lower than, at least where I grew up.
Okay.
Taxes in Luxembourg are maybe slightly higher than they are here. But in exchange, you get great infrastructure, very, very safe, healthcare provided by the government, and it's good healthcare too. I'm just consistently shocked by the fact that people here, the bias is, it seems to be, for a large percentage of people, shrink government, make it as small as possible, everything sucks about it. Rather than like, we should be getting more out of this. I think that's been kind of shocking culturally.
Okay.
You would not get away with that in a lot of places in Europe.
Intriguing. That's a very interesting viewpoint, Mr. Stewart. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. All right, that was all the questions I had, unless there was something else you wanted to expand on.
I don't think so.
All right.
But yeah, it's been fun talking about it.
All right, I appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.
Cool.
Thank you.